We opened our study together tonight with hymn 281. I think this is a hymn that feels very real at the moment. We sang in verse 1 about the light of them that sit in darkness. And the imagery of sitting in the dark, I think, resonates more than it ever did before. Like you, over the last 9 months, I've experienced isolation like never before in my life. I've connected to my brothers and sisters via Zoom, as we are now. My screen full of boxes, each with a brother, a sister, a family in a box. And you, like me, saw a screen full of people sitting in the dark. And we long for the light of our King's presence at long last. Or verse 2, in verse 2, where we sung about the Gentiles adoring idols of wood and stone, and like never before over the last few years, we have witnessed the relentless onslaught on our God and on what he stands for, and the promotion of gods of wood and stone, silicon and chrome. And we long, don't we, for a really different world. We long for a world that is not flooded with memes and posts and tweets and threads, but one that's flooded with his glory. And we sang in verse 3 about the one to whom all power is given. And like never before, I think we're seeing the abuse of power as corrupt politicians, as moral-free corporations, as hate-filled activists become ever louder, ever more omnipresent. And we long for the arrival of one to whom all power is given to speak his word of command and end all of this. And Gideon would have felt the same. I think Gideon would have sung this hymn with a lump in his throat and with tears starting in his eyes. He too experienced isolation, his nation afflicted by a plague of Midianites, forced to hide in soul-destroying isolation and darkness in the caves and the dens, hoping and praying for a savior who would rise and shine. His nation, like ours, was worshipping the inanimate. Not for them, Samsung and Apple, Netflix and Spotify, but gods of wood and stone. But nonetheless, he too felt powerless and hurt by what he saw, and he longed for one who could right this world of wrong. He longed for one to come who could fix the problems that he saw oh so clearly, not just in the world around him, but in the ecclesia and in his own family. He longed for one to fix those problems. But here's the thing. Gideon never thought it was going to be him. Not for a moment. We look at many heroes in Scripture. There's David and there's Paul, Elijah and Joshua, and many of these seem, at least to me, to have been born to be heroes. They're just made of the right stuff, aren't they? As if all that they needed was somebody to hand them a cape and off they would go and save the day. That's not Gideon. That's not the man we're going to look at this weekend. Not at all. You know, I personally feel that Gideon, well, I feel like he's very similar to me. He was scared, he was doubting, he was intensely insecure in his faith, in his courage, in his abilities. He was a man who constantly needed that positive reinforcement and the encouragement of friends, who needed those kind words of affirmation. And I can't speak for you, brothers and sisters, but that's how I feel a lot of the time. I want to make a stand. I want to do the right thing. I do, but I don't want to have to be a hero. My prayer is often something like, God, please use me. Please make me a better, braver man. But please don't make it hurt. And I'm pretty sure Gideon would have felt the same way. Well, what we're going to try and do this weekend is we're going to look at how God used this man, how God made him to rise and to shine, and despite his reluctance, made him the hero that God knew he would be, with God's guidance and God's presence in Gideon's life. So let's set for ourselves the scene. Let's try and picture for ourselves Gideon's world, and as we go, I'm sure you'll see for yourselves the similarities. On entering the land of promise, led by Moses and Joshua, the children of Israel were told to cleanse the land, weren't they? 400 years earlier, Abraham had been told that the land would be won by his descendants when the iniquity of its current occupants was full, when it was completely full. Now, we don't want to go into what it meant or picture that what a fully iniquitous land might look like, and the behaviors that characterized the fullness of the Amorites' iniquity. I think we can see for ourselves in the world around us. But Deuteronomy chapter 20 says this: of the cities of these people which Yahweh your God doth give thee for an inheritance, save nothing that breathes, but thou shalt utterly destroy them. Get rid of them all. Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, as Yahweh your God has commanded you. He gave them an explicit and a clear command on entering the land that they were to wipe out all that breathed. Old man, young man, woman, child, small baby, they were to wipe out everybody inside the land. But you know what? Even though they were told that they must wipe out the moral infection of the Amorites and make it completely extinct inside the land, that was not what God told them to do everywhere. Elsewhere, in non-Amorite territory, non-believers, non-Israelites were allowed to survive. If you went out to war in this time and the children of Israel attacked across their borders as God had envisaged in Moses' time, and an Israelite soldier happened to capture a beautiful woman, he was allowed to keep her alive. He was allowed to take her to wife. He was allowed to make her a member of his family outside the borders of the land. Because the iniquity of the Amorites was so complete inside that land that it was like nowhere else. And God said, you must make a complete end of these people. Inside Abraham's borders, this land was utterly polluted. The minds of its occupants were irretrievably damaged by moral ambiguity, by sexual perversion, by vile religious practice. And the worst of it was that the Israelites, that youthful generation that emerged from the wilderness, untainted by their elders' lack of belief, that lack of belief which had caused that generation to fall like autumn leaves in the wilderness. This new generation, they were not aware of the existential threat that the inhabitants of the land posed. They didn't fear. They didn't fear the doctrines, the thinking, the moral uncleanness of the people inside the land as they should have. Rather than treating these people inside the borders of the land in the way that God said they should, like a lethal pathogen, rather than masking up and making sure that nothing survived, they were much less discriminating than they should have been. Come back to Judges chapter 1. Judges chapter 1. And look at verse 19. Judges 1, verse 19. So here's the first conquest of the children of Israel. And it says, Yahweh was with Judah, and he drave out the inhabitants of the mountain, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had chariots of iron. Okay, well, that happens, doesn't it? You've got this great plan. You're going to take on all of the inheritance that Yahweh has given you. You're going to make a clean sweep. Judah tried to do what God had said, but they couldn't. Perhaps they didn't have enough faith to drive out the inhabitants of the valley. Perhaps if all of Judah had had the courage and faith of Caleb, a man approaching 100 years old, and taking on great cities like Hebron and Arba that had giants in them, perhaps Judah would have been successful in the valleys. But they weren't. Verse 21, and the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites that inhabited Jerusalem, but the Jebusites dwell with the children of Israel in Benjamin in Jerusalem unto this day. Did you notice the change in pronouns? The children of Judah could not. Oh, but Benjamin did not drive out the Canaanites from among them. Verse 27, neither did Manasseh drive out the inhabitants of Bet-shan and her towns and many other places that they tried to conquer, but the Canaanites would dwell in that land. Oh, do you see a difference there? Now the Canaanites are decision makers. They have made a decision to dwell in the land. Nonetheless, it came to pass when Israel was strong, verse 28, that they put the Canaanites to tribute, but they did not fulfill the command of Yahweh in utterly driving them out. What about verse 33? Neither did Naphtali drive out the inhabitants of Beth-shemesh, nor the inhabitants of Beth-anah, but he dwelt among the Canaanites. Now this is a complete reversal. For Manasseh, the Canaanites dwelt among them. The Canaanites were the minority, but here in verse 33, it appears that Naphtali are the minority. He dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Naphtali is not even the inhabitant. No, it is the Canaanite. Nevertheless, they became tributaries unto them. Verse 34, and the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountains. They would not suffer them to come down into the valley. As the Psalms were to record, they did not destroy the nations concerning whom Yahweh commanded them, but were mingled amongst the heathen and learned their works. They served their idols, which were a snare unto them. Yea, they sacrificed their sons and their daughters unto devils. This was the sort of terrible moral practice that God had striven to save his people from. But no, they didn't. They didn't. It was their choice. It was their decision. And so they were mingled with the heathen. They learned their works. They served their idols. Israel's failure to understand the danger that the Amorites presented, not just militarily, but morally, religiously, culturally, would prove fatal. And so when we come to the beginning of our story tonight in Judges chapter 6, verse 1, the first verse of this story should come as no surprise. The children of Israel, Judges 6, verse 1, did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian 7 years. It's no surprise. Rotherham says for that first line, not that they did evil in the sight of Yahweh. No, it's a bit more pointed in the Rotherham version. It says the sons of Israel did the thing that was wicked. The thing. I'm sure we can all recall our Sunday school lessons on the subject of Judges. There was going to be that cycle, wasn't there, of sin followed by suffering, followed by supplication, and God sends a savior. And the story of Gideon in Judges chapter 6 is not the first time, of course, that the sin, suffering, supplication cycle has played out. By this point in Israel's history, they have already suffered for 18 years under Eglon's Moabite empire, and for 20 years before Deborah's decisive victory over Sisera, aided by Jael. But this time, the period of suffering that the children of Israel must go through before the Savior arrives is shorter. It's quite a bit shorter, isn't it? It's 7 years. Just 7 years. 7 years, as we know, it's quite an important number in the Bible, isn't it? 7. It's the covenant number. And we don't just say that. That's not just a thing that someone sort of come up with and it's biblical numerology. It just so happens that the word in Hebrew for 7 is the same word that is used for covenant, the word Shiva. It's used for both purposes. And it does dual service. So why do we think that God chose to allow the children of Israel to suffer under the Moabites for 7 years, a covenant period of years? Is that intentional or perhaps accidental? Well, we'll flick across a few pages to Judges chapter 8, verse 33, because I think we find at least a clue to the answer there in Judges 8, verse 33, because it says there that the children of Israel remembered not the Lord their God, who had delivered, sorry, I'm reading verse 34. Let me try 33. It came to pass, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel turned again and went a-whoring after Balaam, and made Baal Berith their god. They turned again and made Baal Berith their god. Now, you might say, well, who's Baal Berith? Well, Baal Berith was the Lord of the covenant, the Baal of the covenant. You might say that the Baal of 7. And it says they turned again. You see, after Gideon's passing, the children of Israel go back to exactly what they had been up to when the story begins. That's what we're being told here in this verse. As soon as Gideon passes away, the children of Israel slide back into the same old habits they had been in when he started his work with them. What work? What had they been into? What were those habits? Well, they'd been worshipping the Baal of the covenant, a false god to whom they had made covenants, to whom they had made promises. And I think this is why 7 years is used here. A covenant period is chosen by God to drive the message home that the children of Israel's apostasy was noted, that God had seen what they were doing and that he understood they had committed apostasy with a covenant Baal. And so he gave them 7 years under Midian. And to make the point even stronger, Midian was the 6th son of Abraham. After the passing of Sarah, Abraham married again, his 3rd partner. And so after Ishmael and Isaac, Keturah, bare Abraham Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, and Midian. His name means brawling and contentious. Yet for all that, he came from a believing family. In fact, he came from the believing family, didn't he? Midian was brought up in the family of the covenant. And it's almost as if the events were perfectly calculated to draw a connection in the minds of the children of Israel between the damage that worshipping a Baal of covenants did to their relationship with God and his promises. Because Midian, when Midian, this son of the covenant, invaded, well, look at what verse 5 of chapter 6 says. Have a look at this. Chapter 6, verse 5, it says this. For they, Midian's army, came up with their cattle and their tents. They came as grasshoppers for multitude, for they and their camels were without number. They entered to destroy the land. Okay, so they were without number. But flick across to what chapter 7, verse 12 says, and tell me whether this doesn't really hammer home the point for the children of Israel. It says in chapter 7, verse 12, and the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the children of the east lay along in the valley like grasshoppers for multitude. We've already read that. It's the same thing all over again. What's new? Well, look at what it says here. And their camels were without number as the sand by the sea for multitude. This language here, it's drawn, isn't it, straight from the promises to Abraham. It's drawn from the covenant language itself. Almost as if God is saying to them, look, you have broken my covenant with a covenant Baal, so I have sent you suffering for a covenant period of time under a covenant son, and they will bring down a covenant number of the enemy with which to punish you. Their betrayal with Baal Berith resulted in 7 years of suffering, 7 years of the fury of a betrayed God. And the children of Israel were crushed by a son of the covenant. The personality of a nation is often characterized in its leaders. We see that today in the world around us, don't we? With Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin and men like that, almost becoming cartoonish characterizations of the nations which they lead. The Midianites were ruled by Zebah, a man whose name means to slaughter, and by Zalmunna, a man whose name meant to strip away all possibility of defense. And there were 2 terrifying generals who were at the head of the army. One of them was named Oreb. Oreb means the raven, and we can do a mini Bible study if we like on the subject of the raven. But suffice it to say, this is not a positive name. This is not the name that you would call a new household pet in whom you delighted. No, this is a very, very dark name. And Zeb, the other general, his name is just as bleak and awful. It means the evening wolf. These are names doubtlessly won by Oreb and Zeb on the battlefield because they were men who ravened for the sheer pleasure of killing and who took pleasure in stripping the corpses that fell in their dark wake These were men who behaved on the battlefields in which they delighted, just like their namesake, the wolf and the raven. And under Oreb and Zeeb's black banner, in addition to the Midianites, marched the Amalekites. The Amalekites were the very first nation to attack God's people. And they didn't just attack God's people, they behaved in the most calculated and vile manner, picking off the sick and the weak from the perimeter of the nation. And Moses built an altar, and he called the name of that altar Yahweh Nissi. And he said, because God has sworn that he will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. In fact, another version says, for that section there where it talks about God swearing, it says, because there was a hand against the throne of Yahweh. And what we're being told in that version is that the Amalekites, in addition to picking off the weak, strove to undermine God himself. These are the people who march with Oreb and Zeeb and the Midianites. And verse 3 of chapter 6 tells us that in addition to that, they were accompanied by people called the children of the East. Now, we're told in Genesis that Abraham sent his sons eastward. We're told in Job that Job and his friends belonged to the ecclesia in the east. The wise men in the time of the Lord Jesus Christ would come from the east. And Balaam came out of the mountains of the east. Balaam, as he was called in Deuteronomy, Balaam of Mesopotamia. Where was Mesopotamia? Well, Mesopotamia was a territory far to the east of Israel, with notable capitals within it like Babylon and Ur of the Chaldees. We'll learn later in Daniel chapter 1 that Shinar, the place where the treasures of God were taken into the dark temple of an evil god, was Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia was a land of mysticism and of magic, a land of priests and of apostasy. And so marching under one banner are an apostate son of a covenant family, a brutal nation of killers that pick off the weak in Israel and raise a hand against God himself, and a diffuse group of people from far to the east who trade in magic and spells and black trickery. And we can imagine what this onslaught would be like. We know now that they were without number. They were countless. They were like the sand of the seashore. And we can picture for ourselves the wild Arabian warriors holding their curved scimitars above their head as they ride on charging camels, flooding over the Jordan, pouring into the land like a torrent, like a wave, like a vast storm, and flooding down through the valleys of the land, pillaging and destroying and burning until they crashed against that final border, the sea, far down in Philistine territory to the south. There had been some initial resistance when this army first invaded. There was a pitched battle that was fought at Mount Tabor. But on that occasion, Israel's defense was remorselessly crushed, and its generals were personally executed by Zebah and Zalmunna, leaving none to resist. And Judges chapter 6, verse 3 and 4 describes the strategy used by this Midianite invasion, because it says, it was so that when Israel had sown, that the Midianites came up, and the Amalekites and the children of the east, even they came up against them, and they encamped against them and destroyed the increase of the earth until you come to Gaza, and left no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep nor ox nor ass. For they came up with their cattle, their tents, they came as grasshoppers for multitude, both they and their camels were without number, and they entered the land to destroy it. So what they did is, as soon as there was food growing, as soon as there was something available to be eaten, they would come in and they would encamp and they would strip the land bare until there was no sustenance. And the point is made in verse 5 that their intention was not just to get rich by pillaging the land. No, their intention, clearly stated, was to destroy it. They were conducting genocide by starvation. And we should make no mistake, that was the Midianite goal. They wished to destroy the land and the people within it. Psalm 83 is a song that mentions this occasion, and in this song the psalmist says, make their nobles like Oreb and like Zeb, make all their princes like Zebah and Zalmunna. It's a song of condemnation, calling down death upon enemies who are like Oreb and Zeb. But notice what it says that these men said. They said, let us take to ourselves the houses of God in possession. You see, this was about taking back what they felt was rightfully theirs. Midian, a child of the covenant, did not have the land of promise, and they had determined that it should be theirs, and to do so, they were going to kill all that remained of the seed of Isaac. And so the cycle continues. The children of Israel sinned with Baal-berith. They suffered under Midian and their evil allies. And so we read verse 7. It came to pass when the children of Israel cried unto Yahweh because of the Midianites. See, suddenly, in their distress, their prayers became very meaningful. Their prayers became intense and heartfelt. And you know, that's such a common story, isn't it? I'm sure you've experienced this as I have. It can be so hard, can't it, to pray in the good times. But suddenly it becomes very, very easy in the bad, doesn't it? In times of loss and of pain, it becomes very, very easy for us to pray. And now Israel prays powerfully, earnestly now, because of the Midianites. And they've prayed. Supplication, that stage is past, and in verse 8 to 10, God sends the cavalry, and the cavalry arrives. Yahweh sent a prophet. The cavalry that arrives, that God sent on this occasion, really illustrates the problem. It's the problem that is going to be illustrated again in this story. God sends one man, a single prophet. Perhaps the only prophet left that God could muster. Perhaps the only one that remained. And this prophet arrives and he proclaims, thus says the Lord God of Israel. And what he does, this prophet begins to quote Exodus chapter 20 and verse 2. And he quotes it. He says, I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And he begins to quote this passage. And as he says it in verse 8, every Jew in the audience listening would have been able to continue this passage for themselves, because what this prophet was quoting and reciting to them was the most sacred and well-known passage in the whole of the law of Moses. Verse 8, I brought you up from Egypt. I brought you forth out of the land of Egypt. And they would continue. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not have a graven image. You shall not bow down to them. For I am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and the fourth generation. But you see, that's not what the prophet said. The prophet doesn't continue on past the first verse of this quotation from the law of Moses, from the 10 Commandments. He just continues to recite God's mercies. I delivered you. I took you out of the hand of all that oppressed you. I drove them out before you. I gave you their land. I said to you, I am your God. I said, fear not the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwelt. And he continues to recite God's mercies to them. And then notice what he says. He says, but you have not obeyed my voice. And he stops. There's an absolute abruptness here. It's almost as if he said, God did this, and he did this, and he did this, and he did this, and you didn't listen. In Hebrew, it's just 3 words. Lo, Shema, Kol. You did not listen. And that's it. The prophet leaves. He gets up and he walks away. Can we see how stark this would have been? If you forgive the phrase, this is the biblical equivalent of a mic drop. You didn't listen, bang, and away he walks. And you might ask, well, why didn't God use the prophet? Why wasn't the prophet the one who started the Reformation, the one who started the resistance here? It's because, as we will see, God already had a hero in mind, and this hero was one of their own. He was Gideon by name. And so verse 11, and there came an angel of Yahweh. And's a continuing word, isn't it? What follows is part of God's answer. This is part of God's response. This is the second part of God's rescue of his nation. And here is his response to the nation's prayers in caves and in holes in the rock. And you see, summer had arrived in northern Israel. The sky is blue now. The breeze is warm. The weather report that morning in late May would have said something like clear skies. You can expect a maximum of 30 degrees, winds light to variable, and a chance of Midianites by evenfall. And our story starts in a wine press, over the lip of which one can occasionally see a stick rising and falling from within. We can hear the sound of threshing inside this wine press. And near the rocky wine press stands an aged oak. Perhaps it is the same oak that Abraham came to and Jacob used. Perhaps it is that ancient landmark in Ophrah. Now, I'm not going to go into Ophrah in any great detail. It's one of those locations that no one's really quite sure where it is. And I've put a pin in one of the locations that the archaeologist suggests Ophrah may be. It's the one that seems most likely to me from the story, but we could be wrong there. But for reference, I'm going to show you Ophrah from a different perspective. Here is Ophrah. We're now looking westward across the land of Israel. We're looking down from the high country of Jordan, the nation of Jordan, if you like, almost up near Golan, but just a bit further south. And we're looking down into the Jordan Valley, across the Jordan Valley, and out towards the Mediterranean Sea. And I think, well, what I hope you can see is the way that the mountains are built so that they funnel. I'm just actually looking for a pen. That's what I'm ducking around for here. You can see how the mountains funnel in from this point and lead any invader into the interior of the land towards Ophrah. And we're told that an angel came and sat under the oak. Rotherham's Jerusalem Bible and the Young's Literal Translation all say the same, that it wasn't an angel, it was the angel. In fact, in verse 14 and verse 16, the record will call this personage Yahweh. This is not just any old angel that has been sent on this occasion. No, we believe that this is the angel of the presence, perhaps even the great Michael, the archangel himself, sent to speak to yet another warrior in God's army. And he's here to meet a man who's not just threshing in a wine press to hide it. He's not just trying to hide his grain from Midianites, but as the italics indicate, he's actually hiding himself in the wine press. Gideon is not a brave man. He's not the sort of person who would stand out on the hilltop and say, well, if they want me, they can come and get me. No, he's hiding in a wine press to do his work. And the angel observes this undignified stealth, and he begins, verse 12, the angel appears and says, Yahweh is with you, you mighty man of valor. Can you feel the irony of this? Here is a man hunched over inside the lip of a wine press, quietly, stealthily beating away at his grain in a hole in the ground, and an angel, in fact, the mightiest angel of all, says, you mighty man. There would have been nothing that looked less impressive, less powerful, less warrior-like and mighty than Gideon, his skirts hitched up, banging away at grain inside a wine press. How ironic, and yet we're going to see he was a mighty man. And so here for the first time we meet Gideon. Gideon was a man whose way of speaking was gentle and unfailingly polite. We're going to see again and again he uses words like, oh my Lord, and I pray thee. We know that he was a powerfully built man with a kingly bearing. He was a descendant of Gilead, and elsewhere his family is described as lion-like men. And yet we're going to learn he's humble and chronically uncertain. He describes himself as the least, and he needs constant reassurance. He's focused and intense. He's capable of swift action. And he is someone who thinks things over. In short, he's like us. But importantly, he's a man who cares intensely for God's people. Have a look at his response in verse 13 as he peers out of the winepress. Verse 13, he says, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, did not Yahweh bring us up out of Egypt? Now Yahweh has forsaken us. Can you see the pronouns here? The angel was said, the Lord is with you. And he replies, well, if the Lord is with us, You see, this is Gideon. His focus is not on his personal problems. He doesn't immediately say, well, if God is with me, why am I in a winepress? His response is the response that bears in mind the whole ecclesia. Why do we feel this way? Why is the ecclesia hurting? Why is this so difficult? But you see, there's a problem here. Yes, Gideon cares deeply for his brothers and sisters, but you see, he's blaming God, isn't he? Our predicament, says Gideon, is because God abandoned us. And you can hear, I think, the anguish and the frustrated powerlessness in Gideon's accusation. God has betrayed us. And so in verse 14, the angel looked on him. Other versions say, and the angel turned on him. We can imagine that angel turning to look with steely eyes at Gideon, silently and blandly outwaiting Gideon's outburst and staring him down. And then the angel continues. He says, go in this thy might, and you will save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you? What might? Well, it was there. His might is there, but it's not the tone of aggrievement. It's not this comment about you've betrayed us. That's not Gideon's might. What Gideon's might is his care for the ecclesia, his sense of his own sense of powerlessness, and his passion and concern. Those things are what have made him a mighty man. Brothers and sisters, the greatest gift, the most amazing power possessed by believers is our love for one another, a passion for the well-being of each other. This is our greatest strength and our willingness to sacrifice ourselves for the good of our brothers and sisters. And this is what Gideon had. And so in verse 15, we see, yes, Gideon's humility, but we're going to see something more. I think we're going to see the dawning of an appreciation of where the problem lay. He said, oh my Lord, wherewith shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor in Manasseh, and I am least in my father's house. Can you see the dawning of his? It's almost as if the eyes are being opened. He's seeing me. I can't do it. Why can't you do it, Gideon? Is it because personal inability? Are you a man with one leg? Are you missing an arm? Is there something wrong? No, it's his family. My 1,000 is poor. My house is least among them. And on the surface, this seems like false humility. Manasseh was among the leading tribes. It was a very numerous tribe. His clan or 1,000 was in the direct line of Manasseh. Manasseh was the firstborn of Joseph. Machir was the next. Gilead was the next. Abiezer. This is a line of firstborns. We will later learn that his brothers are those who led Israel's earlier resistance, and they are men who were described as kingly. And yet it seems that Gideon's family had fallen on hard times, such that it had become least. Because it seems that there is a problem here. If you think about it, why was Gideon, the scion of a great family, forced to thresh his own grain and to cook a meal for someone else, as we'll see soon? His family obviously had been very, very lowered by the circumstances that surrounded them. And as we'll see, it's because of idolatry. His family has become least, or it seems at least least in Ophrah. And I think we'll see that this is because the worship of Baal-berith was centered in his home, the home of his father. And you can almost hear Gideon's tone of shame. I can't save Israel. My house is where the problem is. It's in my home. And in verse 16, as the angel sees that dawning, he says, I'll be with you, and you will smite the Midianites as one man. And here, the angel is perhaps quoting Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 30, a promise of God to the children of Israel that they would chase 1,000 and 2 would put 10,000 to flight if God was with them. Look, I'm confident that when the angel said to Gideon, you will smite the Midianites as one man, he would have taken that as a metaphor for strength. God was saying to him, look, you be strong, Gideon. Don't worry, I will give you the strength to do the job. But you see, Gideon wasn't going to forget what the angel said to him here. Gideon was not going to miss this particular reference, and it would probably sink down in his mind. God was going to be with him, but the means, the way that God was with him would trouble this insecure hero. And we'll see, I think, that Gideon's mind will worry about this particular promise. You will smite the Midianites as one man. And in verse 17, we see Gideon's deep courtesy. Despite the famine and his poverty, he requests an opportunity to give the angel a present. In Hebrew, this is a mincha, a meal offering, and he politely begs his new acquaintance to wait while he goes off and personally prepares a meal. And what a meal! Here in the depths of a grueling famine, Gideon slays and roasts a kid of the goats. Sure, it was probably scrawny and thin, and yet it would have been fat in Gideon's eyes. And he prepares bread. How much bread? How much bread did Gideon bake for him? Well, we're told an ephah of flour worth. And for those of you wondering, how much is an ephah of flour? Well, it's about 10 times what a man can eat in a day. 10 times. I don't know about you, but I'm imagining 10 loaves of bread, or one very large loaf of bread, one cake of bread made by Gideon on this occasion. And this is cooked along with a broth by Gideon himself in the heart of the famine. That's incredibly generous. And by the way, notice what it says in verse 17 there. Gideon says, if now I've found grace in your sight, show me a sign that you talk with me. That's a funny thing to say. I want a sign that you're actually talking to me. That would be like me saying to you, brothers and sisters, I would like a sign that you are actually listening to me. When I can clearly see that you are there and you're listening to me, of course I'm talking to you. Of course you're listening to me. You have no choice in the matter. It's a very strange thing to be saying. But you see, I don't think that is what Gideon is actually saying on this occasion. He knew that the angel was talking to him. Obviously, that's happening, right? But here we've got an example of classic Gideon uncertainty. He knew God was talking to him. Well, at least he thought he might be. Look, now I think about it, maybe, I'm not sure, he might be, or am I just imagining it? I mean, perhaps this isn't an angel after all. Perhaps it's a prophet. Perhaps it's just some guy. And you can almost see Gideon's self-doubt playing tricks on him. And I don't know if you ever feel that way. Do you ever feel that way about your prayers? We've prayed about something, we're worried about something, and we get this clear answer, and immediately we begin to wonder ourselves, well, is that the answer? Or did we ask for the wrong thing? Or perhaps that would have happened anyway. And we begin to doubt and worry about the answers to our prayers. Well, Gideon is not going to be left in doubt. God is going to help Gideon out. Because in verse 20 and 21, we read how Gideon was instructed to lay his gift on this rock. Lay them upon this rock and pour out the broth. And he did so. Verse 21, the angel put forth the end of his staff, which was in his hand, and touched the flesh, the unleavened cakes, and there rose up fire out of the rock and consumed the cakes. Now, what's really interesting here is that there's actually two different rocks. Two different rocks. The rock in verse 20 is the Hebrew word selah or selah, and it means a lofty, high cliff face. And the rock in verse 21 is the word zur, and it means compressed rock, a low rock or boulder. So you might think to yourself, well, what's happening here? What's going on? These are, I think, the rocks of Gideon's winepress. There would have been a lower rock that was the catchment pool of the wine press itself. The upper rock was the press where you stood in to squeeze the grapes. And see, what's happening here when Gideon's offering is accepted is that fire explodes up from the lower rock, up through the channel between the two rocks, cut into the press, and up into the upper rock, consuming the gift and conveying the angel who was standing on that upper rock up and away into heaven in a column of fire and of smoke. And there's an amazing parable concealed here. It's a message, I think, to Gideon and also to us about the path to acceptance with God. The message is that suffering comes before glory, and that for us, that Christ alone, through Christ alone, can victory be won. Because you see, I think the lower rock represents mortality, and more particularly Christ's mortality. It's a crushed rock. The upper rock of the winepress speaks of glory, Christ's glory. The offering poured out just where Gideon had been standing when he began his conversation spoke of Gideon and of you and me, should we choose to share in that offering. And the messenger? Well, that's our Lord, who could carry our offering above. Only once he had passed from mortality to immortality. And for those of you thinking, oh, that's a long bow, this is not a conveniently contorted connection. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4 tells us that the rock that followed them, the rock that was there at the beginning of the wilderness story, and the rock that was there at the end of the wilderness story, that provided them with water all through the wilderness journey, was Christ. And when we follow that through, we learn that there were two rocks, and the first rock, the rock at the beginning of the wilderness story, was the Zur, a low, crushed rock. And the rock at the end of the wilderness story was an elevated rock. The rock at the beginning, the Zur, was to be smitten, Christ in mortality. And even though Moses failed to follow the instructions of God with the final rock, God had commanded that it was to be spoken to, because this was a rock that spoke of Christ in glory. I'm pretty sure that Gideon didn't see it this way. I'm very confident he didn't have 1 Corinthians to refer to. And we know how Gideon saw these events, because verse 22, when Gideon perceived that he was an angel of Yahweh, Gideon said, "Alas, O Lord God, because I have seen an angel face to face." Doubtless he had been told that those who saw angels died, or some such thing. Why else would you be fearful of an encounter with an angel? This is typical of human doubt and uncertainty. Just think about what's happened. An angel's come. He's said to Gideon, you're a mighty man. He's given him all sorts of encouragement and words of affirmation. He's led him to a personal realization of where the problem lies and given him encouragement to continue. He's accepted an offering from him and performed a miracle to demonstrate that that offering is accepted. And Gideon's response is, oh, now I'm going to die. That's just so human, isn't it? In verse 17, Gideon wanted to be sure that it was really, truly God speaking to him. And now he knows that it really, truly was God speaking to him. He's filled with a sense of fear and a lack of confidence. I relate to this. I don't know about you, but I really do. I pray for strength and guidance in difficult situations and then feel worried about what it means when I get that strength and guidance. But God didn't leave it up to Gideon to sort out his feelings. Verse 23, the Lord said unto him, peace be unto you, fear not, you will not die. The angel has left, but God is still with him, as the angel had said he would be. And God comforts his reluctant servant. Gideon heard a voice nobody else could hear, the voice of God that opened his ear, as it were, morning by morning, and spoke to him and said, don't worry, Gideon, I am with you. It's going to be okay. And so comforted, Gideon builds an altar. Verse 24, he built an altar unto Yahweh, and he called it Yahweh Shalom. It was still there when the book of Judges was finally compiled and completed. There was no offering put on that altar, at least not that we're told. It was just an altar. And perhaps that's because now Gideon maybe sees the point of the sign of the fire in the winepress. In symbol, his offering himself has already ascended. That offering has already been taken. This altar now speaks not of sacrifice, but of fellowship. Yahweh Shalom, peace with God. Gideon's dedication, his present, has been accepted. His fears have been quelled, at least for now, by the voice of God with him, and he is at peace with God. That's probably a really good place to leave it for this evening, brothers and sisters. The thought that when we confess our faults, the faults that lie at our door, on our threshold, in our homes, when we dedicate our lives to God, and when we hear his voice, then, truly then, even in the midst of life's plagues and storms, we find peace. Let's leave it there for tonight.